Okay, welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is about security technology, basically the toys. By the way, this kind of goes into the network. Before you can understand how a firewall works, you really need to understand how, the TCP/IP stack works. And so this gets a little technical, unfortunately. Anyway, page 295. So learning objectives, what are the role in the controls business? Because, you can't just do everything by controls. You have to have some human parts. On the other hand, you do have to have some controls. Authorization, three-factor authentication, that kind of stuff. The firewall technologies and what are the choices. And then, things like, they say dial-up, but the word dial-up is still being used, but it's in the context of authenticating remote users that no one's actually using a phone. And then virtual private network or VPN, which is kind of sort of the same thing. So the opening case study is all about trying to make a decision on a firewall. Some people say, let's keep it simple and let's do this. And they hire a consultant. Apparently, they can't quite make heads or tail of what the consultant is saying. And so they're going to have a meeting. It's not a very good opening case. Okay, so Introduction to Access Control, page 296. So access control, kind of like a definition, how the system knows when to admit a user. Okay? And so it's really a combination of, policies, programs, and technology. That's what we're talking about today. But it could include things like the time of day in addition to who you are. In other words, I can prove I am through some factor we haven't talked about yet. But maybe it's like it's 2 o'clock in the morning. You don't have any access at 2 o'clock in the morning. So it could have more things than that. And normally the things that we're talking about are, do you have access to something at all? And then once you get past that layer, there's a different layer that talks about I have read permission on this or write permission on that, those kind of things. Okay, so they talk about the approaches. So this is kind of a taxonomy of this thing, and so access control, the big picture. Then we have discretionary and non-discretionary. Now these terms are not exactly perfect, but because they're kind of deceiving. Discretionary basically means if I create a folder in my profile on, my machine, on my C drive, I'm the owner of that folder and I get to decide who has permissions on it. In other words, not the administrator. I don't have to call up the administrator and say, hey, would you change this to write permission? It's my folder inside my profile on my PC. I get to decide. So that's discretionary. Non-discretionary is when the user does not have that permission and somebody up high has set it. Now, it might sound like we're talking about, well, on a file server. No, everybody in the file server has an owner, and the owner has discretionary. So we'll talk about that a bit different. And then in the non-discretionary, there's, mandatory kind of use, and then this thing called role-based or task-based, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So I use slightly different terms than the book does because in the Windows world, they use a discretionary access control list, a DACL, okay? And a system access control, a SACL. So SACLs and DACLs. So one more time, discretionary doesn't mean, I can do it if I want to. I don't have to follow the read permissions. That's not at all what that means. Not at all. What that means is the owner gets to make the decision. It's about the owner. Who makes the decision? Okay. Now, in the Windows world, almost everything is a DACL, the discretionary access control list. That's the way it typically is. Even if the account that's used to lock down the root of the C drive might not be a human account. It may be a system account or something. But it's still a single account gets to make that decision. Okay. But a system access control list, a SACL, that is different. In the Windows world, the only place where that's being used is when you turn on auditing. In other words, I go to some folder somewhere and I say, I want to track every single time someone goes here and reads a document or writes a document, okay? And it keeps a log of every single person who's ever been there and what they're doing. That is a SACL, what they would call non-discretionary. Okay, so I'm just going to pop open, just a file, right? I'm just going to go grab this guy, and I'm going to do a right-click and, go to Properties. And then if I go down here to Security, I get to see who has permission. So system, that's not a real human, this, which is me personally, and then this is the administrators of the machine. So I happen to know that I'm in the administrator group. So this is a user, but it's not a human user. This is a group, and then this is an honest-to-God real user. And so right now I have full control for everything. So I've done this demo before, but I'm going to go in here and type edit, and then I'm going to add someone to this. Now, don't worry about what I'm doing right now. This is just a way to get something. And so I'm going to go in here and grab, I don't know, the guests, okay? And I'm going to go in here and say, oh, for guests, I'm going to allow them to read. So I'm allowing them to read. So I've added an extra person, or in this case, since I'm the owner, I get to decide. I get to go in there, and I can even take the system one out or the administrator one out, all those kinds of things. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply to this. And so I've changed the access control list. Okay. We have seen that before. Okay. So role-based is all about, not necessarily who you are, but what group you're in, therefore what roles you have to play. So for example, if I go to a file system and in the accounting department and I say, everyone in accounts payable has write permission to this folder on some network resource somewhere, I don't have to worry about who the person's names are. It's role-based. Okay. And you could have tasks associated to a specific person. I could say, for example, I'm going to take the person who does the backups. Okay. Now doing a backup and a restore actually takes some pretty decent permissions, because I have to be able to read every single file on the entire system, regardless of whether or not I have permissions on it, right? I mean, a backup has to be a true, faithful thing. So I want to tell the backup operator that you have this permission to do this, but I don't want them to use that to go poke around. So I give them a backup role, a task-specific role. And so I go to their account and I give them some extra permissions. So yes, they have godlike powers, but only when they're running the backup program. If they're not running the backup program, then they don't have any more privileges than anyone else. Okay. And so it's not done by name, right? It's done by like group memberships and stuff. Okay, so let's talk about the how you would go about the mechanics of this, the actual honest to God. How do you do this? So here's what I need, this bullet list. I need identification. I am a user. You've verified that I am who I say I am. And then what am I allowed to do? And then can you track to see what they did? So the first three are kind of sort of everyone's ballpark. You need to know, you need to provide here, I say I'm John Doe, and then I can prove that I'm John Doe, and then here's what John Doe can do. The fourth one is kind of like extra. It's like, well, I could track and monitor, but it's not a mandatory requirement. Okay, so let's talk about authentication. So I need to validate your ID. Essentially, I have some sort of an ID. It could be a username, or it could be a security token or a badge or something. And so they talk about the authentication factors, and we're going to be talking about multi-factor authentication, MFA, or three-factor authentication, 3FA. These are kind of important terms. So the three factors that most people use is what you know. For example, I know my password. What I have, like a badge, a smart card, or my phone, if I'm using one of the authentication things. And then what you are, which could be like biometric data, like iris or fingerprint or one of those kinds of things. So those are the basic three classes of classifications. So one solution to what you have is like the Duo or the Authenticator app that's on your phone, right? Now this is cheap because I don't have to buy, security tokens or cat card readers for everyone, So I just wave a magic wand and say, okay, we're all going to be using Duo, or we are going to be using the Microsoft Authenticator on our phones, and therefore we're done. Okay. So this is kind of an example. You could have this little guy, a little token that goes along. this is like a random number thing. And so when you go in and bring up a web page, that you have to look at your little token and type the numbers in, and the numbers change, every minute or so. So this is kind of a cool way of doing it, having some sort of an authenticator token. Those are expensive. So what is three-factor authentication? There's nothing really magical about the three. It's like I'm using three things. So if I said the use of a retinal scanner is three-factor authentication, no, it's one factor, right? You can count. Okay. By the way, in Hollywood, it's almost always like that. Like one of the things they do, for example, is they'll have like a retinal scanner and they'll say, okay, permission granted. It's like, no one ever does it that way. It's almost always multiple factor. You have to have your name and your password and your biometric data, right? All three. Biometrics by itself is rarely ever used like that. And then authorization. So authorization is, okay, you've proven to me that you are who you say you are. Now I need to go see what you're allowed to do. So I'm matching your authentication that you with the permissions, and this is done through that access control list. And a lot of people have when you're designing like a file share, you would come up with call it a matrix, where you have all the resources and all the users, or most likely groups, not users. And then this group has read permission, this group has write, all that kind of good stuff. Okay, so in an access control list, you could have it, the techniques can be kind of weird. You could be a user, or you could be a member of a group, and then you could have this thing, called a federated sign-on, like a super account that goes across all the systems. So you could have like a system ID. And anyway, an access control list can contain all those things. I mean, it's not just tied to one. For example, I showed you one where there was a user and a group and a system kind of a thing. So wait a minute now. What happens if I'm a member of a group that I've given read and write permission to, and I'm a member, and then me personally, someone has given just read permission to? So do I get read and write? I'm a member of a group that has read and write, but I only have read by myself. Yeah, I get the higher of the two. The exception to the rule is if I use a deny, which most people don't ever use deny. There's lots of ways you can go about to prevent using a deny. If I have read and write permission at the group level, and then individually I have a deny, well, the deny trumps everything, and I do not have write permission. Okay. Generally what happens, if there's a difference between the user and the group, they just get added together unless there's a deny. Accountability or auditability. This is about, I need to be able to track objects. So this is not necessarily about tracking you. You don't put an audit flag on a person. You put an object flag on an object, typically a file resource. So if I go to a folder and I turn on auditing to a folder, that means anytime anyone goes there and does a read or lists the files or does a write or copies or paste or whatever, then I have a record of all that. And this way you won't be able to say, well, it wasn't me that did that. It's like, yeah, it was. Okay, so the 3 A's, authentication, authorization, and accountability. Okay, so on page 301, they talk about, biometrics. And, I'm sorry, Hollywood almost always gets this wrong. It's just crazy. But we're coming up on the 15-minute mark, so let's do this in just a few.